Welcome to Dr. Harmony. They say that if your spouse is still by your side after the age of 70, you possess a treasure more valuable than gold. But what happens when that treasure is a polished lie, and the person breathing beside you in the dark is a stranger you funded for 40 years? Today's story is a chilling reminder of why Professor Harrison always said there are 3 things you must say to your partner in your twilight years, not just to honor them, but to unmask them. This is the case of Arthur and Eleanor Vance, a tale of high society betrayal in the heart of Upper East Side Manhattan that will make you look twice at the person sharing your pillow tonight. The silver hair on Arthur Vance's head was as distinguished as the architectural firm he had built from nothing. At 72, he believed he had won the game of life. He sat in his mahogany row library, the scent of expensive pipe tobacco and old books wrapping around him like a shroud of comfort. Across from him sat Eleanor, his wife of 42 years, her grace undiminished by time, her hands steadily pouring Earl Grey from a silver pot. To any onlooker, they were the pinnacle of New York elegance. But Arthur had begun to notice the glitches. It started with a misplaced bank statement, a small, insignificant slip of paper that suggested a wire transfer to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, a destination they hadn't visited in decades. When he asked her about it, Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply smiled, that same serene, practiced smile that had calmed him through market crashes and family deaths, and told him it was likely a clerical error from the trust fund. Arthur wanted to believe her. At 72, you want peace more than truth. But the professor's words echoed in his mind. Arthur, when you reach 70, the strength of a marriage isn't measured by the years you've spent together, but by the secrets you no longer feel the need to keep. That night, Arthur didn't sleep. He watched the rhythmic rise and fall of Eleanor's chest. He realized he didn't actually know where she went on Thursday afternoons. He didn't know why her sister in London, whom she spoke to weekly, never seemed to show up on the caller ID with a British country code. The seeds of suspicion are poisonous. Once planted, they choke the life out of everything beautiful. He began his own investigation, quiet as a ghost in his own home. He hired a private investigator, a man named Miller who specialized in discrete Silver Age discrepancies. Miller looked at Arthur with pity. He had seen this before, the long con, the slow bleed. A week later, Miller handed Arthur a digital folder. There was no sister in London. There was, however, a man named Julian, 45 years younger than Eleanor, living in a penthouse in Greenwich Village. A penthouse purchased through a shell company registered in Eleanor's maiden name. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was a systematic dismantling of Arthur's legacy. Every charity gala, every hospital wing they had donated to together had been a front. Eleanor had been skimming from the top, redirecting the Vance fortune into a private empire for a man who wasn't even her son. Arthur felt the cold grip of a heart attack, but it wasn't physical. It was the death of his reality. He looked at the photographs of Eleanor and Julian, laughing at a bistro in Paris. A trip she told Arthur was a wellness retreat for her nerves. She looked younger in the photos. She looked like a predator who had just finished a long, successful hunt. The professor's first piece of advice for those over 70 was, tell your spouse, I know who you truly are. Arthur realized he had never said those words because he had been blinded by the image he created of her. He invited her to dinner at their favorite spot overlooking Central Park. The city lights twinkled like fallen stars. Eleanor looked radiant in midnight blue silk. She reached across the table to touch his hand. You're quiet tonight, Arthur, she murmured. Is the project in Dubai stressing you out? Arthur looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the micro-expressions of a master manipulator. He felt a surge of cold fury. He wasn't just a husband. He was an ATM with a heartbeat. He thought about the second thing the professor said to tell a spouse. I forgive you for the person you couldn't be. But as he felt the weight of the evidence in his coat pocket, Arthur knew forgiveness was a luxury he couldn't afford if he wanted to survive his 70s with a roof over his head. "I was just thinking about the future, Eleanor," Arthur said, his voice steady, "about where all our hard work goes when we're gone. I reviewed the estate papers today." He saw the slight tightening of her jaw, a fraction of a second where the mask slipped. "Oh? I thought we settled those with the lawyers last year," she replied, her voice as smooth as velvet. Arthur smiled, a thin, sharp movement of his lips. "We did. But I found some discrepancies, some unauthorized diversions." The air at the table turned frigid. The waiter approached to refill their wine, unaware he was stepping into a battlefield. Arthur watched Eleanor's eyes. They didn't fill with guilt. They filled with a cold, calculating light. He knew. The game was no longer a shadow play. The lights were being turned on and the monsters were visible. Eleanor didn't reach for her wine. Instead, she slowly leaned back, her spine pressing against the velvet upholstery of the booth. The facade of the doting, elegant wife evaporated, replaced by a woman who looked as though she had spent a lifetime playing chess while Arthur was playing checkers. "Unauthorized diversions is a very strong term, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its melodic sweetness. "At our age, memory can be a fickle thing. Perhaps you simply forgot the conversations we had about diversifying our interests." Arthur felt a bitter laugh bubble in his throat. "Diversifying into a penthouse in Greenwich Village for a man named Julian. That's quite a portfolio shift, Eleanor." The name Julian hung in the air like a physical blow. For a split second, she looked as though she might deny it, but then she did something far more terrifying. She smiled. It wasn't the smile of a caught spouse. It was the smile of a victor. "Julian is an artist, Arthur. He represents the vitality and passion that you traded for blueprints and steel beams decades ago. You provided the house, but you haven't lived in it for a very long time." The betrayal stung, but the audacity of her justification was what truly burned. Arthur realized that Eleanor hadn't just been stealing money. She had been rewriting the history of their marriage to cast herself as the victim of his ambition. It was a classic narcissistic pivot. He remembered the professor's third piece of advice. "Tell your spouse, I am no longer afraid of the silence between us." For years, Arthur had filled that silence with work, with gifts, and with a desperate need to keep Eleanor happy so he wouldn't have to face the emptiness of their connection. Now, the silence was his only ally. "You think your secrets are safe because I'm old," Arthur whispered, leaning in closer. "You think 70 is the age where the brain softens and the eyes dim. But I've spent 40 years anticipating structural failures before they happen. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the foundation of my own life rotting away?" Eleanor's eyes flickered toward the exit. She was looking for a way out, not just of the restaurant, but of the legal cage Arthur was beginning to build around her. "You have no proof of anything illegal," she hissed. "Everything was signed, every transfer, every gift. You were so busy being the great Arthur Vance that you signed whatever I put in front of you during dessert." She was right. He had trusted her implicitly. He had signed papers while discussing the news, while distracted by phone calls, while basking in the glow of what he thought was a perfect partnership. She had weaponized his trust, but Eleanor had made one fatal mistake. She assumed Arthur's discreet investigator had only found the money. She didn't know that Miller had also found the correspondence, the encrypted messages where she and Julian joked about the architect's eventual demise. They weren't just waiting for him to lose his money. They were waiting for him to lose his life. The realization that his wife was potentially plotting his natural end sent a shiver of pure ice down Arthur's spine. He thought about the vitamins she prepared for him every morning, the herbal teas she insisted he drink for his blood pressure. Suddenly, the comfort of his home felt like a death trap. He looked at the woman across from him, the woman he had loved, protected, and built a world for, and saw a stranger with a lethal intent. I've already contacted the board of the foundation, Arthur said, his voice cold and clinical, the same voice he used to fire incompetent contractors. And I've frozen the accounts associated with the maiden name you thought was hidden, Julian's penthouse. The locks are being changed as we speak. It turns out, when you buy property with embezzled funds from a joint trust, the other party has a very strong claim to immediate repossession. Eleanor's face went pale, the carefully applied rouge standing out like bruises on her skin. You wouldn't, she gasped. The scandal, the papers. You care too much about your reputation. I used to, Arthur admitted. But at 70, reputation is just a ghost. I'd rather be a living man with a tarnished name than a dead man with a statue in the park. He stood up, leaving his meal untouched. He didn't offer to pull out her chair. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. As he walked away, he heard her calling his name, a frantic, high-pitched sound that lacked any of the grace she had cultivated for 40 years. He walked out into the crisp New York night, the air tasting like freedom for the first time in decades. But as he signaled for a taxi, he saw a black sedan idling across the street, a car he recognized from the PI's photos. Julian was there, waiting for her, or perhaps waiting for him. Arthur realized the game was far from over. Eleanor wasn't just going to walk away from the Vance fortune, and Julian wasn't just a boy toy. He was a partner in a multi-million-dollar heist. The professor's advice had unmasked the enemy, but now Arthur had to survive the confrontation. He didn't go back to the penthouse. He went to a hotel under a name she wouldn't guess, his mother's maiden name. He needed a night to think, to plan, and to decide which of the professor's truths he would deliver next. Because the third truth wasn't just about silence. It was about the finality of an ending. As he sat in the hotel room staring at the skyline, Arthur opened his briefcase. There was one more document Miller had found, one that Arthur hadn't even told Eleanor about yet. It was a life insurance policy, recently altered. If Arthur died of natural causes in the next 6 months, the payout wouldn't go to the foundation or his children. It would go entirely to a private trust managed by a law firm in Zurich, a firm where Eleanor's sister was listed as the primary contact. The plot wasn't just about the money he had now. It was about the price on his head. The hotel room was sterile, a stark contrast to the velvet-lined warmth of the Vance estate. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed, the hum of the air conditioner, the only sound in the room. He felt the weight of his 72-year in every bone. He had spent his life designing structures that could withstand hurricanes, yet he had failed to notice the termites eating away at his own home. He pulled out his phone and dialed Miller. The private investigator picked up on the second ring. "You're not at the penthouse," Miller stated, his voice flat. "Good. My man on the street saw Julian's car follow you halfway to the restaurant and then circle back to your building. They're regrouping." Arthur's hand shook slightly. He was waiting for her, or was he waiting for me to not come home? Miller sighed. "Arthur, men like Julian don't play for small stakes. You're worth more to them as a memory than as a husband." "That life insurance policy you found?" "That's the finish line. They've been waiting for your heart to give out. But since you're stubbornly healthy, they were probably going to help nature along. You need to stay put. I'm sending a security detail to your floor." Arthur thanked him and hung up, staring at the door. He thought of the professor's words again. The 3 things. He had said the first, "I know who you are," but the second, "I forgive you for the person you couldn't be," felt like ash in his mouth. How do you forgive someone who wants you in a grave? He realized then that the professor wasn't talking about sentimental forgiveness. He was talking about the release of expectations. Arthur had to forgive himself for expecting Eleanor to be his partner. He had to accept that she was a predator, and you don't bargain with a predator. You outsmart it. He spent the night reviewing his assets. He had a secret weapon, the Vance vault. It wasn't a physical safe, but a digital archive of every architectural contract he had ever signed, including the ones Eleanor thought she had manipulated. He began to cross-reference the signatures. He found that Eleanor had been forging his handwriting for years, but she was a perfectionist. She used a digital pen. A digital pen leaves a forensic trace, a timestamp that didn't match the locations Arthur was in on those dates. Morning light filtered through the New York smog. Arthur hadn't slept, but he felt a strange, cold clarity. He called his lead attorney, Marcus Thorne. "Marcus, I need to trigger the sunset clause in my will, immediately." There was a long silence on the other end. "Arthur, that clause effectively liquidates the estate into a charitable trust upon your death, or upon a filing of marital fraud. It's a scorched earth policy. Are you sure?" Arthur looked at the photo of Eleanor on his phone, one he hadn't deleted yet. "She's already burned the house down, Marcus. I'm just controlling the direction of the flames." By noon, the legal machinery was in motion. Arthur was no longer just a betrayed husband. He was a litigant. But he knew Eleanor wouldn't go quietly. She had 40 years of social capital. She would claim he was suffering from dementia, that he was paranoid, that he was the one who had been abusive. He needed more than just financial records. He needed a confession. He decided to do the one thing Miller advised against. He went back, not to the penthouse, but to their summer cottage in the Hamptons, the place where Eleanor usually went to decompress. He knew Julian would be there. It was the one place they felt safe. He drove himself, refusing the security detail for the final mile. He wanted them to see him alone. He wanted them to think he was weak, a broken old man coming to beg for his life or his dignity. As he pulled into the gravel driveway, he saw Julian's black sedan parked under the willow tree. The cottage was beautiful, a shingle-style masterpiece Arthur had designed for their 10th anniversary. Now, it looked like a tomb. He walked to the front door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't use his key. He knocked. The door opened and Julian stood there. He was younger than the photo suggested, barely 30, with the kind of sculpted jawline and vacant eyes that belonged on a billboard. He was wearing Arthur's silk robe. The sight of it made Arthur's stomach turn. "Mr. Vance," Julian said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "You're a long way from the city. Eleanor said you were unwell." Arthur pushed past him, his cane clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. "I'm quite well, Julian. In fact, I've never seen things more clearly. Where is my wife?" Eleanor appeared at the top of the stairs, still in her nightgown, a glass of amber liquid in her hand. She didn't look surprised. She looked bored. "You always were dramatic, Arthur. Coming all this way just to play the martyr." "Julian, get him some tea. He looks pale." Arthur sat in his favorite armchair, the one facing the ocean. "The game is over, Eleanor. I've filed the sunset clause. The money is gone. The penthouse is being seized. Julian's accounts are currently being flagged for money laundering by the feds." Julian's composure cracked. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes darting toward the kitchen. Arthur knew that look. It was the look of a man considering a violent exit. "You're lying," Julian hissed. "You can't just freeze everything." Arthur held up his phone. "Watch the news or check your balance. I've spent my life building things to last. I know exactly how to tear them down." Eleanor walked down the stairs, her heels clicking like a countdown. "You think you've won because you have the money. Arthur, I have the stories. I have the records of every shady deal you ever made to get those city contracts. If I go down, the Vance name becomes a curse." Arthur looked at her and felt a profound sense of pity. This was the woman he had shared his life with. She was willing to destroy everything they had built together just to spite him. He remembered the third thing the professor told him to say. He looked her in the eye and said it. I am no longer afraid of the silence between us, Eleanor, because in that silence, I finally heard the truth of what you are. Eleanor paused on the final step of the staircase, the glass in her hand trembling just enough to make the ice clink. For a moment, the silence Arthur mentioned settled over the room like a heavy, suffocating fog. Julian moved toward the kitchen counter, his hand hovering near a heavy marble rolling pin. His eyes locked on Eleanor, waiting for a signal. The tension was a living thing, a coiled spring ready to snap. Arthur, despite the terror thrumming in his veins, remained perfectly still. He had survived the cutthroat world of New York real estate by knowing when to hold his breath and when to strike. "You think a few records of city contracts will scare me?" Arthur asked, his voice sounding hollow in the vast, open-plan living room. "I've spent 40 years building a reputation for integrity. People will see your records for what they are, the desperate fabrications of a woman caught in a multi-million-dollar fraud. Do you really think our friends at the Metropolitan Museum or the Opera will take your side? You were always the ornament, Eleanor. I was the architect." The insult hit home. Eleanor's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She had spent decades cultivating her status as the queen of New York high society, and Arthur had just reminded her that her crown was gold-plated and borrowed. Julian stepped forward, his youthful face twisted into a sneer. "The old man talks a lot for someone whose heart could stop at any second," he said, his voice losing its polished edge and revealing a rough, street-hardened undertone. "You're alone out here, Arthur. No security, no cameras, just a big house and a long drop to the rocks below." He began to circle the armchair, moving with the predatory grace of someone much younger. Arthur didn't turn his head. He kept his gaze fixed on Eleanor. He knew she was the brain. Julian was merely the blunt instrument. "If anything happens to me here, Julian, you'll never see a dime," Arthur said calmly. "The sunset clause is triggered by my death under suspicious circumstances. The entire estate immediately transfers to a global trust managed by a board that hates both of you. You'd be killing the golden goose before it could lay its final bitter egg." Julian stopped. He looked at Eleanor, his confidence wavering. He wasn't a murderer. He was a con artist. There was a significant difference between stealing from an old man and ending him. The risk-reward ratio had suddenly shifted into dangerous territory. Eleanor set her glass down on the side table with a sharp thwack. "Enough, Julian," she snapped. She turned back to Arthur, her eyes cold as flint. "You always were so clever with your contracts and your clauses. But you forgot one thing, Arthur. I know where the bodies are buried. Literally. I know about the 1994 bridge project. I know about the structural adjustments you made to save $20 million. If I go to the federal prosecutors, you won't just be poor. You'll be in a cell." Arthur felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. The 1994 project was the one shadow on his career. A mistake made in the heat of a younger man's greed that he had spent decades trying to rectify. He hadn't realized she knew the specifics. She had been playing a much longer game than he ever imagined. She hadn't just been stealing his money. She had been collecting his sins. The professor's second lesson, "I forgive you for the person you couldn't be," came back to him again. He had to forgive himself for that old mistake, or it would be the chain she used to drag him down. "Then go to them," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly firm. "I've already written a full confession and handed it to Miller. It's to be delivered to the district attorney if I disappear or if you attempt to blackmail me. I'd rather spend my last years in a minimum security prison knowing you're in a maximum security one, Eleanor. At 72, I have nothing left to lose." Can you say the same? You've never spent a day without a silk sheet in your life. How will you handle a thin cot and orange polyester? The silence returned, but this time it was Eleanor who seemed to be struggling to breathe. The power dynamic was a seesaw, and Arthur had just jumped on the heavy end. He saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was realizing that Arthur had reached the point of twilight clarity, where the fear of consequences is replaced by a desire for truth. She couldn't use his past against him if he was willing to set fire to it himself. Julian, sensing the shift, looked from Eleanor to Arthur. "We can make a deal," the younger man suggested, his voice desperate. "Just give us enough to get out of the country. We'll disappear. You can have your quiet life, your integrity, all of it. Just let us go." Arthur looked at Julian, seeing the pathetic desperation of a man who realized he had hitched his wagon to a falling star. "You were never part of the deal, Julian. You're just a line item that's been deleted." Arthur stood up, leaning heavily on his cane, but refusing to look weak. "I'm leaving now. The lawyers will contact the morning. You have 24 hours to vacate the penthouse and this cottage. If you're still here when the sun sets tomorrow, the police will be the ones helping you pack." He turned his back on them, a move of immense risk, and began the slow walk toward the door. Every step felt like a mile. He expected a blow to the back of his head, a hand around his throat, or the sound of Eleanor's voice screaming for Julian to stop him. But there was only the sound of his own cane hitting the wood. Thump, thump, thump. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back one last time. Eleanor was standing by the window, looking out at the ocean she had always claimed to love, but never understood. She looked small, stripped of the grand theater of her Manhattan life. "The three things, Eleanor," Arthur whispered, though she couldn't hear him. "I know who you are. I forgive you, and I am no longer afraid." He stepped out into the salt-tinged air, the wind whipping his silver hair. He got into his car and drove away, not looking in the rearview mirror until he reached the main road. He was alive. He was broke, or soon would be. But for the first time in 40 years, he wasn't being lied to. The drive back to Manhattan was a blur of neon lights and the rhythmic thumping of tires against the pavement. Arthur didn't head to the hotel this time. He drove straight to the one place Eleanor would never think to look for him. The small, cramped studio apartment in Queens that he had kept as a private archive for decades. It was a dusty space, filled with blueprints that had never been digitized, and old models of buildings that now defined the New York skyline. As he climbed the narrow stairs, his knees aching with every step, he felt a strange sense of homecoming. This was where the great Arthur Vance had started, before the silk suits and the boardrooms had layered him in a shell of pretense. He sat at an old drafting table, the moonlight filtering through a window that overlooked a train track. He checked his phone. No calls from Eleanor, no frantic texts from Julian. The silence was absolute, yet it wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a battlefield after the cannons had stopped, but before the smoke had cleared. Arthur knew Eleanor wouldn't just pack a suitcase and vanish. She was a creature of habit and vanity. She would fight for the penthouse and the jewelry as if they were her very skin. But he had a secret weapon she hadn't accounted for, the 3 vows Professor Harrison had taught him. He had spoken the words, but now he had to live the reality of the 3rd vow, the fearlessness of the end. At 3 a.m., his phone buzzed. It was a message from Miller, the investigator. "Arthur, Julian just left the Hamptons. He's driving fast toward the city, but he's not alone. He picked up a second passenger at a gas station, a man we've identified as Victor Thorne, your lawyer's estranged brother. This is getting complicated." Arthur felt a cold pit form in his stomach. Victor Thorne was a disgraced former prosecutor who knew every loophole in the New York Penal Code. If Eleanor had recruited him, she wasn't just looking to protect her assets. She was looking to dismantle Arthur's legal standing entirely. They were going to play the incapacity card. They were going to claim Arthur had lost his mind. He realized then that the sunset clause was a double-edged sword. To trigger it, Arthur had to be of sound mind. If Eleanor could prove he was suffering from late-stage dementia or a paranoid breakdown, she could have the filing annulled and place him under a conservatorship. She wouldn't just take his money, she would take his freedom. He would spend the rest of his life in a high-end wellness center, while she and Julian spent his fortune. It was a classic New York power play, brutal and efficient. Arthur looked at his hands, spotted with age, and wondered if he really did look the part of a crumbling mind to the outside world. He spent the rest of the night writing. Not legal documents, but a letter to his children, Ethan and Clara, who had been estranged from him for years, driven away by Eleanor's subtle manipulations. She had convinced them that Arthur was a cold, work-obsessed tyrant who cared more for steel beams than for his own blood. He had let her be the bridge between him and his children, and she had burned that bridge long ago. In the letter, he told them everything. He told them about the 3 things the professor had said. He told them about Julian. He told them about the 1994 project. He didn't ask for their forgiveness. He only asked for their witness. As the sun began to rise over the East River, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Arthur made a phone call. Not to a lawyer, but to a journalist he had known for 30 years, a woman named Sarah who specialized in the fall of the Titans. He knew that in a city like New York, the only thing more powerful than a legal injunction was a front-page story. If he was going down, he would make sure the explosion was visible from space. "Sarah," he said when she answered, his voice cracking slightly. "This is Arthur Vance. I have a story for you. It's about a house built on sand, and the woman who's been digging out the foundation for 40 years. They met at a diner in Long Island City, a place where no one would recognize a man of his stature." Sarah listened in silence as Arthur laid out the evidence. The offshore accounts, the forged signatures, the photographs of Julian, and finally, the life insurance policy. She looked at him with a mixture of professional hunger and genuine pity. "Arthur, if I run this, your life as you know it is over. The Vance name will be synonymous with a soap opera. You'll lose the respect of every board you sit on." Arthur took a sip of the bitter diner coffee and smiled. "Sarah, at 70, I don't want respect. I want the truth. I've spent my life making things look beautiful from the outside. I'm tired of the facade. Let the walls fall." As he left the diner, he saw the black sedan again. Julian was getting bolder. He wasn't even hiding anymore. The car was parked across the street, its tinted windows reflecting the morning light. Arthur didn't run. He didn't call the police. He walked straight up to the driver's side window and knocked. The glass slid down slowly, revealing Julian's startled face. "You forgot the first thing I told you, Julian," Arthur said, his voice calm and terrifyingly steady. "I know who you are, and I know you're not a killer. You're a parasite, and a parasite can't survive if the host decides to die on his own terms. Go back to Eleanor. Tell her the story breaks tomorrow. Tell her the silence is finally over." Julian didn't say a word. The arrogance that had radiated from him at the cottage was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man who realized he had brought a knife to a nuclear standoff. He rolled up the window and peeled away, the tires screeching against the asphalt of Long Island City. Arthur watched him go, feeling a strange sense of lightness. He had always feared the scandal, the whispers in the hallways of the Yale Club, the looks of pity from his peers. But as he stood on the greasy sidewalk, he realized that the Vance identity was a prison he had built for himself, and Eleanor had simply been the warden. He returned to his small studio in Queens to wait. The next 12 hours would be the most critical of his life. He spent the afternoon organizing his final pieces of evidence for Sarah, the journalist. He knew Victor Thorne would be moving fast. By now, Eleanor would have signed the papers to petition for an emergency guardianship. They would claim Arthur was a danger to himself, citing his disappearance to a rundown studio in Queens as proof of a mental break. He had to stay one step ahead. Around 4 p.m., a knock came at the door. It wasn't the police and it wasn't Julian. It was Ethan, his eldest son. They hadn't spoken in 3 years. Ethan stood in the doorway looking around the dusty room with a mixture of confusion and heartbreak. "Dad? Sarah called me. She said I needed to hear the truth from you before I read it in the Sunday Times." Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. He gestured for his son to sit on a rickety wooden stool. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, Ethan. I let her come between us, 'cause it was easier than facing the fact that I had failed as a husband." For the next 2 hours, Arthur did something he hadn't done in decades. He was honest. He didn't play the patriarch. He didn't talk about his legacy. He talked about his fear. The fear of being alone at 70, the fear of admitting his wife didn't love him, and the 3 truths he had finally embraced. Ethan listened, his initial skepticism melting into a grim realization. "She told us you were the one who wanted the offshore accounts, Dad. She said you were hiding money from the tax man and that we had to keep it quiet to protect you. She made us accomplices in our own disinheritance." The depth of Eleanor's web was staggering. She hadn't just stolen Arthur's money. She had stolen his children's respect, using fear as a tether to keep them from looking too closely at the books. "She's working with Victor Thorne now," Ethan warned. "I heard them on the phone. They have a doctor lined up to sign the competency papers tonight. They're planning to pick you up at the penthouse this evening. They don't know you're here yet." Arthur nodded. "Then we don't go to the penthouse. We go to the one place Eleanor feels most invincible." Arthur knew Eleanor's calendar by heart. Tonight was the annual gala for the New York Historical Society, an event she had chaired for a decade. It was her stage, her throne room. She would be there, draped in diamonds and the Vance name, playing the part of the concerned wife to anyone who would listen. If he was going to unmask her, it had to be in front of the world she valued most. "Ethan, I need you to drive me, and I need you to call Clara. Tell her if she ever wants to see the man her father really is, she needs to be at the museum at 8 p.m. As they drove toward Manhattan, Arthur felt the third vow, the fearlessness of silence, solidify within him. He wasn't going there to scream or cause a scene. He was going there to deliver her the final truth. He dressed in his finest tuxedo, which he had kept in a garment bag at the studio. He looked every bit the billionaire architect, but beneath the silk, he was a man who had already said goodbye to his wealth. He checked his watch. The digital timestamp on the forensic files had been sent to the museum's board of directors 10 minutes ago. When they arrived at the museum, the red carpet was rolled out and flashbulbs were popping. It was a sea of New York royalty. Arthur stepped out of the car, leaning on his cane, Ethan at his side. The photographers went wild. Arthur Vance, who had been missing for 48 hours, appearing at the gala. As he entered the grand hall, he saw Eleanor at the far end, surrounded by a circle of admirers. She was wearing a gown of shimmering silver, looking like a queen. Beside her stood Victor Thorne, whispering in her ear. When Eleanor saw Arthur, her smile didn't falter, but her eyes turned into chips of ice. She moved toward him, her hands outstretched as if to embrace a lost child. "Arthur, darling, we've been so worried. You haven't been yourself lately." She reached for him, her voice loud enough for the nearby socialites to hear. "Victor and the doctor were just looking for you. You need your medication, dear." It was the opening move of her final gambit. She was branding him unwell in front of everyone. Arthur didn't pull away. He let her take his hands, but he didn't return the squeeze. He looked her directly in the eye, the same way he had at the restaurant. "The medication won't be necessary, Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying through the sudden hush of the room. The only thing I'm suffering from is a long overdue clarity. He looked around at the gathered elite, the people who had been their friends for 40 years. I'm sure you've all received the email from the board regarding the Vance Foundation's recent audit. It seems my wife has been more creative with our donations than any of us realized. The silence that followed Arthur's statement was more deafening than a physical blast. The socialites of New York, trained from birth to ignore unpleasantries, found themselves unable to look away. Eleanor's hands dropped from his, her fingers curling into tight, manicured claws. Behind her, Victor Thorne took a step back, his legal instincts screaming at him to distance himself from a sinking ship. The three things Professor Harrison had spoken of were no longer just philosophical advice. They were the blueprint for the demolition of a 40-year lie. "Arthur, you're making a scene," Eleanor whispered, her voice a sharp blade of desperation, masked as concern. "You're confused. The stress of the new project has been too much. Victor, help him to the car." She signaled to two large men in suits. Private security she had likely hired under the guise of protection. But before they could move, Ethan stepped forward, his presence a solid wall between his father and the mercenaries. "He's not going anywhere, Eleanor," Ethan said, his voice echoing with a strength he hadn't felt in years. "And I think you should stop calling him darling. The police are in the lobby and they aren't here for the hors d'oeuvres." A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. Arthur watched Eleanor's face. For the first time, he saw the cracks in the marble. She looked at Victor, but the lawyer was already busy looking at his phone, realizing that the Vance vault files Arthur had leaked to the board contained more than just financial discrepancies. They contained the forged signatures Victor himself had helped facilitate. The betrayal was a circle. It had finally come back to the person who started it. "I told you once, Eleanor," Arthur said, leaning slightly on his cane, "that I know who you are, but I realize now I didn't say the most important part. I know who I am without you." He looked around the room, at the faces of people who had toasted his success while he lived in a hollow shell. "For 40 years I built skyscrapers to hide the fact that I was living in a basement of lies. I was so afraid of the silence of an empty house that I let a predator share my bed. But the professor was right. When you reach 70, the only thing you have left is the truth. And the truth is, I'd rather be a lonely man in a studio apartment than a king in a palace built on your deceit." Eleanor's facade finally shattered. Her face twisted into a snarl that no diamond could distract from. "You think you've won? You're an old man, Arthur. Without me, you're just a relic. I gave you the best years of my life. I kept your secrets. I built your social empire." She stepped closer, her voice rising to a screech that silenced the quartet playing in the background. "You're nothing without the Vance name, and I'm the one who made that name mean something." "No, Eleanor," Arthur replied softly. "You're the one who made it a brand. I'm the one who made it a legacy. And today, I'm retiring the brand." He turned to the crowd. "I apologize for ruining the evening, but as the professor always said, the second thing you must say to your spouse after 70 is, 'I forgive you for the person you couldn't be.' Eleanor, I forgive you for not being the partner I thought I had. I forgive you for your greed because it showed me my own blindness. But forgiveness is not the same as permission." At that moment, the museum doors swung open again. It wasn't the police. Not yet. It was Clara, Arthur's daughter, clutching a tablet. She walked straight to her father, her eyes red from crying, but her posture resolute. "I found the Zurich files, Dad," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I found the messages to the sister. It wasn't just Julian. There were others before him. She's been doing this since the 90s. The room gasped. The scandal was no longer a financial dispute. It was a systemic, decades-long betrayal. Eleanor looked at her daughter, the girl she had spent years poisoning against Arthur, and realized she had lost her last piece of leverage. The children she had used as pawns had finally flipped the board. Arthur looked at his wife, the woman he had once thought was the love of his life, and felt a profound sense of release. The third thing, I am no longer afraid of the silence, was finally true. He didn't need to shout, he didn't need to hit back, he just needed to stand in the light. "The police are waiting in the coat room, Eleanor," Arthur said. "They have questions about the insurance policy and the natural causes you and Julian were discussing. I suggest you go quietly. The press is already outside, and I'm sure you'd prefer to keep your dignity, or what's left of it." As the security detail Eleanor had hired realized the tide had turned, they stepped aside. Two plainclothes officers moved in. The clinking of handcuffs was the only sound in the grand hall. As they led Eleanor away, she didn't look back. She didn't cry. She simply walked with her head high, a fallen queen heading to a cell. Arthur watched her go, and, for a fleeting second, he felt a pang of grief for the woman he thought she was. But then he felt Ethan's hand on his shoulder, and Clara's hand in his. "Let's go home, Dad," Clara whispered. Arthur looked at the museum, at the art and the wealth, and then at his children. "I don't have a home anymore, Clara," he said. "At least not the one you remember." Ethan smiled, a genuine warm expression Arthur hadn't seen in a decade. "Then we'll build a new one. You're an architect, remember? You're good at starting from the ground up." The fallout from the gala was a firestorm that consumed the New York tabloids for weeks. Arthur Vance, the man who had shaped the city's skyline, was now the face of the most sensational betrayal of the decade. But while the city gossiped, Arthur found himself in a state of quiet transition. He moved out of the penthouse, leaving behind the Italian marble and the silk tapestries that had become a gilded cage. He settled into a small, light-filled loft in Brooklyn, a space that was honest, with exposed brick and the raw scent of cedar. It was a place where he could finally breathe without the suffocating perfume of Eleanor's lies. Professor Harrison visited him one afternoon, bringing a bottle of modest scotch and a stack of old sketches. The two men sat by a window that looked out over the bridge Arthur had helped design 30 years ago. "You did it, Arthur," the professor said, his voice a weathered rasp. "You spoke the three truths. Most people go to their graves with those words rotting in their chests. How does it feel to be a man with nothing left to hide?" Arthur poured 2 glasses, his hands remarkably steady for a man who had lost his fortune. "It feels like waking up from a 40-year dream, Professor. I spent my life terrified of what people would see if they looked past the facade. I thought Eleanor was my protector, the one who kept the world from seeing my flaws. I didn't realize she was the one magnifying them, so I would stay dependent on her." He took a sip of the scotch, the warmth blooming in his chest. "I'm broke, Professor. The legal fees and the restitution for the foundation have wiped me out. But for the first time in my life, I don't feel poor." The legal battle was far from over, but the momentum had shifted. With Victor Thorne under investigation for conspiracy, and Eleanor facing charges of grand larceny and attempted insurance fraud, the Vance empire was being dismantled, brick by brick. Julian had vanished the night of the gala, fleeing the country with whatever jewelry he had managed to snatch from the Hamptons cottage. He was a ghost, a small-time grifter who had accidentally stepped into a lion's den and barely escaped with his life. Arthur didn't care about the money Julian had taken. It was a small price to pay for the silence that now filled Arthur's soul, a silence that was no longer empty but full of peace. Ethan and Clara became constants in his new life. They spent Sunday afternoons at the loft, helping Arthur sort through decades of architectural archives. They discovered a man they never knew, an artist who had once dreamt of building sustainable housing for the poor, a dream that had been sidelined by Eleanor's thirst for prestige and high society standing. "Why didn't you ever build these, Dad?" Clara asked, holding up a sketch of a modular community center. Arthur looked at the drawing, the lines sharp and full of hope. "I was told they weren't Vance enough," he admitted. "I was told they were beneath our brand." The realization that he had sacrificed his passion for a brand managed by a traitor was a bitter pill. But Arthur refused to let it choke him. At 72, he decided he wasn't retired. He was redirected. He began taking pro bono consultations for urban renewal projects, using his name, now stripped of its untouchable aura, to help those who actually needed his expertise. The Vance name was no longer a synonym for wealth. It was becoming a symbol of resilience. One evening, a letter arrived from the correctional facility where Eleanor was being held pending trial. It was written on lined yellow paper, a far cry from the embossed stationery she had used for 40 years. Arthur hesitated, the familiar pull of her influence tugging at his heart. He thought of the second thing the professor said, "I forgive you for the person you couldn't be." He opened the letter. It wasn't a confession or an apology. It was a list of demands. Her favorite moisturizers, a request for a specific lawyer, and a reminder that appearances must be maintained. Arthur read the letter twice, then slowly walked to the fireplace. He realized that Eleanor hadn't changed. She was still trying to build a structure out of thin air, still trying to manipulate the world to fit her narrative. She was incapable of the honesty required for the twilight years. He dropped the letter into the flames and watched it curl into ash. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel spite. He simply felt the finality of the third truth. He was no longer afraid of her silence, and he no longer needed her words. The professor watched him from the armchair. "You're learning, Arthur. Forgiveness isn't about letting the other person off the hook. It's about taking the hook out of your own heart. She can't hurt you anymore, 'cause you've stopped giving her the tools to do so." Arthur nodded, looking out at the city as the lights began to twinkle. He was an old man, starting over in a world that didn't owe him anything. He had lost his palace, his status, and the woman he thought was his soulmate. But as he stood in his simple loft, surrounded by his children and his true friends, Arthur Vance realized he had finally built something that would actually last. The legal proceedings against Eleanor Vance became the trial of the century for the New York elite. But as the courtroom drama played out on every television screen in the city, Arthur Vance remained conspicuously absent. He had no desire to witness the final unraveling of the woman he had loved. Instead, he spent his days in the Brooklyn loft, his hands once again covered in graphite and ink. He was working on a project that the old Arthur would have considered a waste of time, a community garden and library for an underprivileged neighborhood in the Bronx. It was a structure of glass and light, designed not to impress but to serve. One rainy Tuesday, Miller dropped by the loft. The investigator looked different without the shadow of a tailing job hanging over him. He looked relieved. "Julian was picked up in Lisbon," Miller said, tossing a folder onto Arthur's drafting table. "He tried to sell one of Eleanor's vintage necklaces at a high-end auction house. The fool didn't realize that particular piece was flagged by Interpol the moment you filed the fraud report. He's being extradited." Arthur looked at the photo of Julian in handcuffs. The young man looked older, his charm evaporated by the reality of a foreign cell. "And Eleanor?" Arthur asked quietly. Miller sighed. "She's pleading insanity, Arthur. Victor Thorne is trying to argue that the stress of your supposed mental decline pushed her into a state of dissociative fugue. They're trying to say she was managing the money to protect the family from your irrationality." Arthur couldn't help but chuckle. It was a poetic irony. The very weapon she had tried to use to lock him away was now her only defense against a 20-year prison sentence. "Let her play her games, Miller. The forensic accounting doesn't lie. Numbers are the only thing in this world that don't have an ego." As the months passed, the silence that Arthur had once feared became his greatest sanctuary. He found that without the constant noise of Eleanor's social calendar and the underlying hum of her deceit, he could actually hear his own thoughts. He remembered the professor's 3 things again. He had said them to Eleanor, but he realized he had to say them to himself as well. I know who you are, Arthur. He was a man who had been proud, a man who had been blind, but a man who was capable of change, even at the finish line. I forgive you for the person you couldn't be. He forgave the younger version of himself for the 1994 project and for choosing status over substance. And, finally, I am no longer afraid. His children, Ethan and Clara, were no longer just names on a trust fund. They were his partners. Together they formed the Vance Legacy Project, a non-profit dedicated to forensic auditing for elderly victims of financial abuse. They were taking the wreckage of their own family and using it to build a lighthouse for others. One evening, Clara brought her young son, Leo, to the loft. The boy ran to the window, marveling at the bridges and the skyscrapers. "Did you build all of those, Grandpa?" Leo asked, his eyes wide with wonder. Arthur knelt down beside his grandson, his joints complaining, but his heart light. "I built the shells of them, Leo, but I forgot to look at what was happening inside. Always remember, a building is only as strong as the people who live in it." He looked at Clara, who was watching them with a soft smile. In that moment, the wealth he had lost felt like a cheap price for the connection he had gained. The professor's advice wasn't just about surviving a betrayal. It was about the radical act of being honest when the world expects you to keep up appearances. As the date for the final sentencing approached, Arthur received a final request from the district attorney. They wanted a victim impact statement. They wanted him to stand in court and tell the judge how Eleanor's actions had destroyed his life. Arthur sat at his desk for a long time, the pen hovering over the paper. He thought about the 3 things. He thought about the fire in the fireplace and the light in his children's eyes. He realized that if he went to that courtroom to dwell on the destruction, he would still be tied to her. He would still be a character in her drama. He wrote only 1 sentence on the paper. "The truth has already set me free. I have no further testimony to offer." He sent it off and turned back to his sketches. He was designing a roof garden for the community center, a place where people could grow something beautiful out of the dirt. He realized that at 72, he wasn't just an architect of buildings anymore. He was an architect of a life that was small, honest, and entirely his own. The betrayal had been the earthquake, but the reconstruction was the masterpiece. The city continued to roar outside his window, a million stories of greed and ambition playing out in the glass towers across the water. But in the loft in Brooklyn, there was a stillness that felt like a prayer. Arthur Vance, the man who had built the city, was finally at home. He had spoken his truths, he had faced his ghosts, and he had found that the silence, after 70, isn't an ending. It's the only place where you can finally hear the music. The gavel finally fell on the Vance case, but Arthur wasn't there to hear it. The news reached him via a brief text from Miller. Eleanor had been sentenced to 15 years. Victor Thorne had lost his license, and the assets recovered were being funneled into the victims' fund Arthur had helped establish. The grand drama that had once defined his existence was now just a closed file in a courthouse basement. Arthur stood on the balcony of his loft, watching the sun dip below the New York skyline, painting the steel and glass in shades of fire. He felt no triumph, only a profound, quiet gratitude for the air in his lungs. The professor joined him for one last sunset. They stood together in silence for a long time. 2 men who had seen the rise and fall of empires, both physical and personal. "You look younger, Arthur," the professor remarked, leaning on the railing. "The weight of a secret is a heavy thing to carry for 40 years. It bows the back more than age ever could." Arthur smiled, watching a flock of birds navigate the currents between the buildings. "I used to think that saying those 3 things, the truth, the forgiveness, and the fearlessness, would be the end of my life. I thought the scandal would kill me. But it was the lying that was killing me. The truth was the only thing that kept me alive. Arthur's new project, the Bronx Community Center, opened its doors that winter. It wasn't mentioned in the society columns, and there were no celebrities in attendance. Instead, the halls were filled with the laughter of children and the quiet murmurs of elderly residents finding warmth in the library. Arthur walked through the building he had designed with his own hands, feeling the strength of the foundation. He had used the last of his personal funds to ensure the materials were the best available. It was his final signature on the city he loved. Not a monument to his ego, but a gift to the future. As he sat in the library, a young woman approached him, holding a book on architecture. "Are you the man who built this?" she asked. Arthur looked at her, seeing the same spark of ambition he had once carried. "I helped," he replied modestly. "But a building like this is built by everyone who uses it." He realized then that his legacy wasn't in the skyscrapers that bore his name, but in the honesty of this small space. He had finally learned that the most important structures aren't made of stone. They are made of the truths we tell the people we love, and the courage we find to stand alone when those truths are challenged. Arthur Vance lived to see many more sunsets. He became a fixture in his new neighborhood, the silver-haired man who always had a kind word and a sharp eye for detail. He never remarried, and he never spoke to Eleanor again. He didn't need to. The 3 things he had said to her had served their purpose. They had cleared the ground for a new life, one built on the solid rock of reality rather than the shifting sands of pretense. When he finally passed away at 85, he died in his sleep, in a room filled with sunlight and the sketches of his children. He left behind no scandals, only a lesson that would echo through the city for generations. The story of Arthur and Eleanor Vance serves as a powerful testament to the human spirit's ability to reclaim itself, no matter how late the hour. If you are lucky enough to have your spouse beside you after 70, remember the professor's words. Use them to bridge the gaps or to find the strength to walk away. Because at the end of the day, the only treasure you can take with you is the truth of who you were and how you loved. Thank you for joining us for this journey into the heart of the Vance family mystery. If this story moved you or made you rethink the relationships in your own life, please give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Arthur was right to forgive? Don't forget to subscribe to Dr. Harmony and hit the notification bell so you never miss a lesson in life, love, and the strength of the human heart. Until next time, stay grounded and stay true.